What we're going to be doing is talking about storytelling as an evaluation methodology a little bit later. I'm going to be giving you some overview context of the hiring process and how to make better hires, of which the guided storytelling is one element. I'm glad to see you all here. I'm the CEO of the Bryan Group, which is a Nevada company that does business and education management consulting. And we have people, as some of you saw, in terms of people who are attending from Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Colorado, California, and so forth. We're only a little over a year old, but moving along briskly. So let's talk about what can make this a good session for all of us concerned. And I always have a rules of the road I put up. One of the things that is important is that people feel as though they can be engaged in this and not just sitting in the background. So I'd like participants to be candid, challenge, push back if you disagree with something that I have to say. I like to keep it informal and interactive throughout it, at least it's at one level or another. In terms of participating, I would ask that you would use the chat function so we can manage the time. And Suzanne, one of my colleagues who is on today, will be the gatekeeper for those and, getting a few together and then jumping at appropriate times. And if you're really got a passion to have your say about something, then unmute and we'll glad to hear what you have to say. So respecting others, sharing the time, so forth. I'm going to be moving quickly. This handout you will be provided. There are things in here we probably won't cover, but you'll have it as a resource. And that's pretty much it. So at any time, if you have a comment or question, go ahead with the chat function. Rather than talk first about our objectives and our agenda, our roadmap for the day, I'd like to start right off in terms of getting people engaged in terms of their typical questions that they ask in an interview. And if you would write those down, put it in the chat. Suzanne will grab them and then unmute herself and feed us with some of those. So just take a minute. If you've got one or two favorite questions, what are the ones that you like to use? And Suzanne, why don't you feed them to me as you get them?
Okay, here's a first. How do your coworkers describe you and your work?
Okay, good. Any others?
What excites you about this opportunity? And what hesitations do you have? How do I prevent deception?
Okay, we'll put that in a different category. That's about our process, which we will get to. Okay, we'll take one or two more if we've got them.
Where do you see yourself 5 years from now? Asked back in 2015.
Okay, when we already have that up there as a sample already.
But we have a jokester in the crowd that they want to know if you asked it in 2015, what would people have said?
Yeah.
Another one, Bill, is what do you know about XYZ company?
Very typical, usual, but guess what? Those questions that we have in that left column have little, if any, predictive validity as to whether anybody has competence, and they will do what they say. And this is based on 50 years of behavioral science here. I'll try not to get too technical, but if at times you have questions about why that's the case, let me know. They really don't tell you anything. You may feel good that you're getting an answer that you can count on, but when they're actually measured as to will they do those in the context you needed, the answer is no. So the bottom line, throw out all those questions. I'm going to give you some substitutes in a very different process. And as noted, any challenges, let me know. So let's talk about today's program. Gaining an appreciation of the elements essential for making good hires. So we're looking at it in a little bit bigger picture, but we're going to be getting to the storytelling because it does get to the deception issue and how not to be fooled. We want you to understand the value of the guided storytelling piece in making a good hire. And really, it helps sort out those who are good at getting a job from those who can do the job. And unfortunately, there are a lot more of the former than the latter. Bottom line is to reduce the number of incidents of selection remorse. Was it Gordon that said, so you've got somebody in there, they're tenured. There's lots of remorse in university and education settings because of that. So we want to reduce the chances of that. And we have a methodology for doing it. So our roadmap for the day, we've done our typical interview questions and requests. We can check that one off. We're going to take a look next at the 3 elements of a good hire. We're going to do something called a bartender exercise. And it's too bad we're not in person because we could make that a little more live and lively. We're going to take a look at different types of interviews. Then we're going to be looking at the guided storytelling interview and key elements, and we're going to do a demonstration of it. And then we're going to wrap it up. If you've got any questions or comments or challenges along the way, fire away. So the question here is, obviously, why should you pay attention to anything I have to say? I'm really glad to see you. Love your smiling faces, get to meet new people. But is there any value here? Will this end up being a waste of time for you? Well, let me do a little credibility building here. I've been advisor to, co-founder or founder of at least 11 startups and maybe a 12th coming up. One failure, so it's a pretty good hit rate. 50 years of consulting experience to hundreds of organizations in all major sectors, clients ranging from small businesses to a number, probably between 12 and 15 Fortune 500 companies I've worked for. Over 40 years of applied competency and motivation research aimed at identifying what differentiates top from average and poor performers, mostly leaders. And to give you a little snapshot, because this motivation and competency research really is the behavioral science that underpins what we're talking about today. When I got out of college, I was a captain in the Army for 4 years. And after that, got a doctorate in clinical psychology and worked with kids and families in schools, but switched over to business. And my switch to business was very fortunate that I was hired by the head of the sociology, social relations and psychology departments at Harvard, a fellow by the name of David McClelland. And he was considered one of the world's top motivation and competency researchers. And what he was doing was building a methodology for helping businesses in the military understand what competence was all about, identify what superstars were doing that was different than average and poor performers, particularly leaders, and how to bottle that and make it measurable. And so I was a project manager for his consulting firm. And after 4 years, I left him to actually compete with him. And that turned out to be very successful. But this competency motivation research and the validity and rigor that goes behind it is what I'm bringing you today. I've had positions at 5 universities along the way in different type of topic areas, so I stay up with a lot of different stuff. My overall passion is to improve leader and team effectiveness and performance and talent management functions, to include the implementation of major change initiatives, which I've done with a lot of organizations. At one point in time, I had the Navy's contract to do their leadership research and development work. So broad experience. When you look across all of this, it's always people. It's always people that make the difference in an organization. You can have technology, you can have the other things, but they tend to be more enablers of your success than necessarily the total reason for the success. So good management, good leaders, good producers with the supports and resources and technology. It's a mix. I can tell you, with all of this background of consulting, having done hundreds of assignments, I can count on one hand the number of times when I've been called in to help an organization that the issue hasn't been leadership. So my particular passion is around leaders and leadership. And right now in this latest company that I've put together, I'm really trying to help the education sector bring better leaders into those positions in public education, the top position, superintendent of schools. So a lot of effort going into that. So 3 elements of a good hire. Won't spend a lot of time on it. We're going to delve into pieces of it. You've got to have detailed and measurable selection criteria, and this is where a lot of the behavioral science comes in. You need to be able to measure people's role proficiencies. And what I mean by that is in a particular position, people will wear different hats. You know, today I'm a technician. Today, later in the day, I've got to be a leader. Later in the day, I've got to be a researcher. I've got to be a mediator. And as people change hats based on what the job demands, there are certain tasks that they must do at a high level. So you need to measure what the hats are somebody needs to wear that are most critical and how you measure that, whether they're wearing that hat well. Then their competencies. Those are the knowledge, skills, and talents that help a person demonstrate those roles, to do the roles well. Then there are leadership styles. That's kind of an amalgam of knowledge, skills, and talents that are used in certain settings that really highlight how somebody interacts with people given certain demands. And then there are things called derailers, which are really failure factors. What do we know that if you demonstrate in this job, you will fail? And that means you've got to understand the culture of the company, the job, what's really being required, and why have people failed in the past. And you need to be able to measure all of these things. And I'm going to give you some sample measures in a minute. So once you've got the criteria established, which takes a bit of time to do it well, and make it, detailed, valid, and measurable, then you'll start looking around. Here, I've got the criteria. Where are we going to find these people? How do we recruit? What's our sourcing strategy? I'm not going to talk about that at all today. There are some ways of getting and finding people. Keep in mind that 85 to 90% of the people who are qualified for the job you're looking for aren't looking for the job. So you've got to be prepared in many cases to go after them. Then we've got the evaluation techniques. Okay, we've got the criteria. We've got candidates to evaluate. What are we going to evaluate and how are we going to do it? Well, if you're into the typical type of job screening process, you're going to look at their application. You're going to do a short interview to see if they're in the game. I'm putting GSI as guided storytelling interview. This is where we use the guided storytelling, and that's one of the sieves, the screens you put them through is a short one, then a long one, and we'll be talking about the detail of that. Then you have them come in for meet and greets with colleagues, their supervisor, board members. You look for work samples, you do simulations, and you do reference checking. And most reference checking is done very poorly, but it's essential because there are certain things you won't find out about people, like their character and other derailers, unless you do really good reference checks. They don't offer those up to you during the interview. And then you do formal criminal background checks and things like that. So we're going to talk a bit first about detailed measurable criteria, because you're interviewing, no matter how good it is a waste of time if you don't have measurable criteria. And if you see most things when headhunters and others or people in HR are doing it, they're saying, oh, we need initiative, we need technical competence around this, but they don't have the measures to go with it. So it doesn't give you any predictable validity at all. So let's take a look at what we mean. I'm going to give you several slices on detailed and measurable selection criteria. And then I'll stop for a minute and see if you have any specific questions or concerns. So what are some of the challenges around criteria? Well, one, how do you address the fact that experience, extroversion, and charisma often do not correlate with competence, but are weighed heavily in the typical selection process? People get picked not for competence, but for personality. Now, there may be aspects of personality that demonstrate competence, which is fine as long as that's what you're looking for. But unfortunately, a lot of people with charisma, they're articulate, extroverted, smile a lot, will get picked over the person who's more of an introvert, but has what I call quiet competence. And how do you get through their differences in personality to be fair and to really understand what they bring to the table? The guided storytelling will do that for you. How do you remove personal biases in the evaluation process? Well, there's no chance of removing biases if you don't have detailed criteria, because then you have people on your search committee or who are making the decisions arguing. And if you don't have tight criteria, the people who are most like you that you're interviewing will be your favorites. You'll pick them. It's just human nature, just the way it works, 1000% of the time. How do you eliminate false positives and false negatives? Well, that's what we're talking about here. Understanding what you're trying to measure, and then using the techniques to measure them. It really gets personal bias out of it and gets the bias around candidates, because you form an opinion of a candidate in your first 3 seconds, whether you like them or not, for whatever reason the case may be. But if you don't stay data-based and criteria-based, that will taint and bias all of your conversation from that point on. So what we're looking for is making sure that we have the right criteria, seeing how somebody stacks up against those criteria, and then saying, who's the best fit? You know, is Smiley Man your best fit? Well, if it's in your criteria, it's fine. So I'm going to stop right there for a moment and just see if there's any challenges to what I've said, or you need some elaboration that would be helpful to you in how you're doing your hiring. So I'll give you a minute or so, just throw in any comments or questions. Okay, I'm going to make the assumption that I'm making sense for you so far. If that changes, let us know. So I've got a little example for you. And this is one that people would find, even though they're not going to be great interviewers when they leave this, they'll know what they should be doing. They may not know how to do it yet. But just understanding jobs and criteria from 4 perspectives. And I'd like you to think about these 4 perspectives we're going to talk about here in the context of owning a bar. One of my clients for over 20 years was Anheuser-Busch. I know bars really well, and what it takes. And the bartender is the linchpin of whether you're going to be profitable or not, successful or not. And let's assume you own a bar and you've just found out that someone is putting a bar across the street from you, a new fancy themed bar. And they may eat your lunch if you're not really on top of your game and your bartenders are not really performing at a really high level. But what does it mean to perform at a high level as a bartender? So the challenge for you right now on a separate piece of paper or in your head or whatever the case may be is to just think of 1 or 2 items for each of these columns. And let me explain them a little further. In the first column, A, measurable results and outputs, let's say at the end of a week, how are you going to know what the impact of that bartender was? What are you specifically going to measure? And this is often a stretch for people, particularly when you talk about softer type jobs that are more interpersonal, you know, managerial jobs. But I can guarantee you that you can, if you put your mind to it, come up with really concrete measures. And that's what you need to do. So 1 or 2 measures of a bartender that you're going to want to look at the end of the week to see how they're performing, maybe see if they're performing better. We talked about roles before, major tasks and processes. What are the things, and this is more a traditional job description, what are the things that the bartender does that are critical as far as tasks in that bar? Just 1 or 2 or 3. So that's kind of the what of the job. Let's switch over now to the C, the basic knowledge, skills, and talents. And that starts to get into the how of the job. I'd like you to think for yourself, list down 1 or 2 skills, but not that make the bartender a superstar, but make the bartender okay, at least meets a minimum average of being adequate. So what are some of those adequacy type capabilities that you're looking for? And then finally, in the left column, think about the best bartender you've ever known. What makes for a super bartender? What else would they demonstrate in terms of skills and talents and so forth. And we usually call those competencies, those things that put you over the top. Now, those competencies may be an elaboration or a building on a basic knowledge skill, but in many cases, they're a whole different ability that supports doing roles at a higher level and getting measurable results. So let me give you a minute and just jot down a couple things for yourself. If you can do one or two for each column. And then if you would put those on the chat, just so that we have a few examples, that'd be terrific.
So Lou, is your attitude and listening skills, which column do you want that in?
Say that again.
We have Lou has asked for, it has included attitude and listening skills.
I would put attitude in the D column, and there's two levels of listening skills. There's advanced, which would go in the D, and sort of basic listening or interpersonal skills, which would go in C. And the reason for that differentiation we'll be discussing shortly. Okay, I'm going to move to the, yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Great cocktails.
Make cocktails?
Great cocktails.
Oh, great cocktails. Well, I would put that as customer feedback in the first column. You know, customer satisfaction measure, great cocktails. Somebody had to say it was great cocktails. Let's move down, and I'm going to give you the typical types of responses that we get. And you can match these to the ones that you have. And we could add some we captured already in terms of, you know, like Lou's, we've got
attitude and listening skills.
Yeah, let's put over here positive attitude. And I thought we had listening somewhere. We've got listening here at the advanced level, but we need some basic listening over here too.
And the last one, Bill, was great cocktails.
Okay, yeah. So I'm just going to say customer sat, great cocktails. So this is the first step in starting to create measurable criteria, but it's got a long way to go. But at least it gets you to the point of sorting out, what is this job really all about? Do I have my arms around what it would take and the standards that I would be setting for someone for them to be a top performer? Now, let me just ask this question in general. As you usually, A is kind of hard to come up with, B is easy because it's just kind of looking at what people do in their job. C isn't too hard. Oh yeah, reading, writing, arithmetic. Mixology is, you know, the knowledge of drink making, that sort of stuff. The D gets a little tougher to identify specifically. But as you look at C and D, what's the fundamental difference between the things listed in C and those listed in D? Anybody? You can chat it, or if you want to unmute on this one, that would be fine too.
So we have a response. Jody says not required, but great to have.
The ones in the left, the D column?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yep. Okay, that's one way of looking at it, which is true. Any others?
C is listed as a learned skill. So the things in column C are things you can learn.
Right. All right. So here's the crux of the matter, and that nails it. C has a relatively short learning curve. It's part of our environment. We've learned how to read, write, arithmetic, basic interpersonal skills. Honesty may, in some cases, fall into the D column, but it's sure basic. You'd want it when somebody walked in the door. The problem that we have is that most selection is made in columns C and B, in terms of what did the person do? Have you done this experience? And do you have these basic skills? But they really don't connect the dots and don't really connect the columns in terms of impact on outputs. And remember me saying that I've had 40 years of doing motivation and competency research. In every single job, no matter what the level was or type of the job that I've assessed, D was a differentiator between those who were successful in that position versus those who were not. And in some cases, technical competence was inversely related to success. Now, if it's a pure technical job, then obviously a certain level of technical competence will come into play. But if there's any job where there's, interpersonal, where things like resilience, accountability, showing up at work, all of those sorts of things, those are all in the D column and are much more personality. So what we've got is that what we really want to measure, what we really want to set criteria around is the advanced bartender type things, because that's the chemistry of success. The question is, how do we measure it? So we have to come up with detailed measures of the success here. And this is something that would be a challenge in university settings, but you can do it. And what are the tools we're going to use to measure? And really the only tool that does this is storytelling, that gets you at the chemistry of success. Because otherwise we know those other questions are useless, and I'll make more of the case. So this picture down the bottom just reflected when we did research, we would have blind groups of people, and originally what we would do is the behavioral event interview. In recent years, it's the guided storytelling. And we do storytelling and we record it. You may have a 50 or 150 page transcript of the stories. And then you can go through those stories and you can score them in terms of what gets demonstrated or not. But what you do in the beginning, if you're creating a model, what are the superstars versus the poor, average and poor doing? You just blindly go in. You're not looking for initiative. You're not looking for functional expertise. You're not looking for work ethic or integrity. You just go in and you say, what is this person doing in their job in this context? And then you describe it. And then what you do is you pull all the transcripts apart. And you say, what are the superstars versus the average versus the poor doing? And every single time, the types of things, as I'm showing you here, the types of things where I've got the pluses, the superstars, the top performers, they're doing much more frequently or to the exclusion of the average. And the poor, you just wish that they would take the negative things they do and take them off the job. So this is kind of the background in kind of crude manner, telling you what the research is all about. Another thing to keep in mind, this tip is absolutely essential. Whenever I ask people what is the number one motivating factor and is related to productivity and job satisfaction, I hear money, I hear pats on the back, I hear, good friends to work with, all of that. All of the research says, no. If you want people to produce, help them to become competent. And you can only do that with clear role and job expectations. So role clarity is the number one predictor of productivity and satisfaction. So not only are you trying to put this picture together for hiring purposes, you're trying to get that picture together to develop people in their jobs as well, so that expectations are really up to date on a monthly basis. When I worked with organizations going through high change, like I worked with Entergy Corporation when energy was being deregulated, in terms of production, transmission, and retail. And they were having a heck of a time defining what their job should be because they'd never had to think about it or be competitive. So we literally designed jobs for them, and it was captured all of these elements, but the tools that we used were different. But we were looking at those jobs every quarter in depth and saying, has this job changed? Have the people that you're interfacing with changed? What are the demands changing? Because you just don't get out in front and you don't gain competitive advantage without having that really under your belt well. So we've talked about details now in terms of this type of breakout, but let's talk now more about, remember we talked about roles and having to measure what are those hats the person needs to wear well. We talked about roles, competencies, leadership style, and failure factors. Here's the level of detail that you need. And I'm just grabbing. Usually when we do a position, we limit it to 5 to 7 roles. And there are 70 to 100 roles that you will typically see in a business setting and educational settings and so forth. But pick the 5 to 7 that are most critical. They have to wear, if they wear those hats well, then they'll probably do the job well. And don't worry about the other ones. They'll get brought under that hat one way or another. And then we usually identify 10 to 12 competencies. And we are doing this based on our research. We have a competency library, a role library with indicators and detail, but we also are working with people on the job, the bosses, the stakeholders, the customers, the people in the community, who's ever interacting with the person in that job. And usually about half of the measures that we have come from our research, but the other half come from the context of the job that you're studying. So it really reflects the needs of the company and the business you're working with. So one of the things we know is that in this case, for example, this was for a superintendent of schools, and that community builder was really one of the essential roles. And just to give you an example, one of the competencies required to do that role, wear that hat well, is political savvy. And I'm not going to go into all of it, but if the person doesn't have political savvy, and there were a couple other hats that required that as well, they don't make the cut. They don't get to the next round of screening. So it just gives you the idea. So then we've got the leadership style. There are 8 leadership styles. 4 are functional and 4 are dysfunctional. This is one of the functional leadership styles. The styles are captain, convener, coach, and influencer. And you really want to understand those and prioritize those. And you've got to be able to measure them. The only way you can measure this stuff, see whether they're demonstrating these behaviors or these tasks and activities, is through storytelling. You don't get it any other way. And then in this case, this was from an actual school district. They were really concerned because they'd had problems in the past with people that they had brought in. They get really good salaries. Superintendent of schools get pretty darn good salaries. But they were being used as a stepping stone, and they wanted someone who could commit to the district. And they said careerism, this was one of about 4 for this particular district. Careerism was a real issue for them, and people coming in just wanting to work a year or 2 and then move on. And if you know anything about change leadership and making changes, you need a leader in position a minimum of 3 years, and usually 5 to 7 if you've got major change initiatives going on. Let me stop there for a moment before we go on to the next, because I know I'm feeding you the fire hose here with a lot of concepts and a lot of detail. So let's take a minute, see if there are any questions or pushback.
So I have a question here, Bill. We have core values of competence, curiosity, character, and commitment. I'm having a lot of trouble identifying these values in the interview and on the resume.
Right. We would need to turn those into, and those are awfully broad. They probably have subcategories. You probably would end up breaking out 2 or 3 competencies for each of those categories that you mentioned. It's such that you you probably would end up with 10 to 12 competencies. Values and beliefs fall in the competency category. But it's doable, but you know, that would be a whole other workshop, and how do you create this level of detail? But that's what you're looking to do. Any others, Suzanne?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. So if you're going to get smart in terms of, I'm going to not reveal a piece here for the moment, but look at the chart at the bottom of the page. You've really got to be savvy about what are the screening vehicles that you're using. What does, and the A, B's, and C's here say, A, that's terrific. It will give you, you'll be able to measure those types of items in that role. So for example, if we look in the long interview, you will be able, it gives it an A from the long interview, the GSI, the storytelling, you will be able to get role proficiency and measure it. You'll also be able to get competencies, but you won't get derailers very well, and you won't get characteristics very well, but you'll get credentials. You have to go down to the reference check to get at an A level, the leadership style and the derailers and the character issues. So as you think about the different tools you're using, you or your HR department, take a look at the screening vehicles, and you really got to get your arms around which of these criteria, these detailed criteria that we're looking for, which tools and screening methodologies are going to get us that. And that's really, really important. For example, you don't get, but these things only really work, the ones in red, if you're using the storytelling. If you're using traditional interview, most of these things across the board are going to be X, because it has no validity. It really will not predict whether the person will perform or not. And when we do reference checks, you have to use storytelling, because if you don't get the person providing the reference check to tell you stories about that person in context on the job, you really won't get what you're looking for. They don't want to tell you what they think about the person, but you'll get much more information. They are willing to tell a story about the person, or multiple stories that shows them how they operate in their job. So I know it's high detail, but and also, by the way, you do want to use work samples or simulations when we are working with educators, for example, and they want to come up with a teacher evaluation system and they're hiring teachers. Well, if you want to see how a teacher teaches, then put them in a classroom. You know, there's a work sample right there, or put them in specific simulations. So the guided storytelling with work samples and simulations are really going to give you the most information. And I just kind of like these two cartoons. I always thought the IKEA job interview was great. Talk about a work sample or a, you know, whatever. And the other one on the right is, you know, if you've got measures for handling stress by spiders and it's valid, then, you know, this is a work sample, you know, or a simulation, you know, there it goes. But usually one of the things you want to do is you don't want to put people in a stressful interview situation. The more stress you put in there, the less able they will be to source memories and to give you the information that you need. And by the way, don't use panel interviews. Panel interviews are a total waste of time. And anybody wants more information on that, I will give you that. Plus the crazy EEOC thing of asking the same questions over and over again, that is nutty and doesn't give you anything. The guided storytelling as an assessment tool has never been challenged by EEOC. So what are the types of interviews? From the bottom being the worst, I put a grade in front of it. Traditional interview is a total F. A critical incident interview, this was made by first done in the 50s by a Major Flanagan in, I think it was Army Air Force at the time. And he used it to study screw ups in the battlefield, or when a ship, you know, rammed another ship, or a plane missed the carrier deck, or there was friendly fire. But he came up with a methodology of starting to interview in more detail incidents and getting people's perspectives of incidents, different people. Then came the behavioral interview. This is very popular now. Tell me about a time when you had to confront the boss. Tell me about a time when you had to fire somebody. That is much better than the traditional and a little bit better than the critical incident, but it doesn't come close to the guided storytelling. Part of the problem is you can prepare for these. And another part of the problem is that you're putting words in the interviewee's mouth. And you really want stories that are told that are most important to them. When you lead somebody to give you information, you instantly lose validity of what you hear. The behavioral event interview I mentioned earlier, that was with the Harvard group. And in the last 40 years since being with them, a much higher refinement, and which I'm now calling storytelling, gives you the best. So what's good about storytelling? And I'm just going to quick this because we're running fast forward here on time, but it has multiple uses. It's not just hiring. Deep listening is really what this is all about. Deep listening for skills, competencies, needs, wants, desires, concerns. The storytelling gets you that better than anything. And what do you get for it? Well, you can assess people against competency models, criteria, and for hiring, development, and job fit. But doing this develops deep listening skills to better understand stakeholders and customer needs. And that helps build stronger relationships. I have a customer mapping process that is used to build better customer relationships. And a core element of it is using the guided storytelling to really understand customer needs and use that to create some very targeted and in-person surveys that can be used in a much broader sense to really find out what customers need from you as a provider. In the education realm, understanding student engagement and social emotional intelligence, it works really well. I've worked with kids in kindergarten using the guided storytelling to see how they adapt to stress and what social emotional competence they bring to the party. Teaching people, peers, to use it with each other to build support, particularly like in the education system. English language learners have lots of stress and strain, and their ability to gain empathy really is helpful. And then we talked about creating competency models. So what's the value that we're doing by using the guided storytelling? High predictive validity with regard to what the candidate will demonstrate on the job. Just about impossible to fake and prepare for. Maybe the 1 in 1,000 sociopath who's extremely bright can pull the wool over your eyes for 1 or 2 stories, but that would be it. Because when they come into a hiring interview, they don't know what you're asking. That's part of it. You're just saying, tell stories, which we'll describe. And you are able to look, because competence travels, you can measure, if you look from story to story to story, is there consistency? And anything that's made up won't have consistency. So that question about being deceived, you can really get through that. You've got the right measurable criteria and you use the storytelling, you will not be deceived. It makes comparison of candidates easier. We have a standard, we create a standard form with plug in the unique criteria, but we use the standard form when we're screening the application, when we're doing short interviews, long interviews, meet and greets. We do really consistent screening along the way. It provides interviewees with deep insight on their behavior and competence. They will often at the end of it, because this can last 3 to 4 hours, when you're getting to the full application of it. They will at the end of it say, I'm exhausted, but you know what? This is the best interview I've ever been through. You know more about me than anybody I've ever talked with. And you know what else? I learned some stuff about myself today that I didn't realize. Those are the types of benefits that you get from doing this. It really sells the organization. Now, I'm talking about this being really long. I'll also, if we have time, tell you how we turned around an investment banking firm on Wall Street, their recruiting of top performing business school grads by using this approach.
The other thing I wanted to add is that the part about number 3, to highlight number 3, Bill.
Yeah.
about removing the bias, because you have the measurable criteria, you're hearing where this shows up in stories and across stories, that idea of bias being removed is really important.
Okay, so I hope you're not glazing over yet, because I know this is a lot to take in. So let's talk about the elements. So now we're actually talking to the guided storytelling piece of the screening process itself. So we've got the criteria, we've got different screening tools, but this is really where the rubber meets the road. So the first part of it is an oral resume, and you're literally having somebody take you from high school right up to their current job and talking you through it and telling you, giving you their thoughts and feelings about what they liked in that particular job, what they didn't like, what their transition thinking was, what things they were doing off the job. And during the oral resume, you're looking for what we call competency themes. We're looking for, are you seeing things like work ethic and political savvy and technical expertise and accomplishments, things that would fill in those 4 columns of the bartender. And in particular, you can really, ring the bell for those specific and measurable criteria that you've got. Current job demands, that's it. What job are you in now? And you're looking for priority setting, you're looking for organizational structure, you're looking for supervisory relationships, you're looking for what's a typical day look for you. Please pull out your calendar. Walk me through a typical day at work if you have such a thing. Otherwise, just grab a day. Look at your calendar. Take me from the time you woke up to the end of the day. Gives you an idea of how the people think about where they spend their time.
We have a good question.
Yeah.
What do you do for people who are over 50 and you're trying to have them remember what they did in high school?
No problem. Never a problem, believe it or not. And they have no problems remembering stories either. And I'll get to the reason of that in a moment. It's rare, and that's the case. And by the way, we always, when we're doing formal, if we've been asked to train people or help them do the formal screening, it's all being recorded. So if somebody who's part of the search process can't be there, they can come back and look at it. Or if we want to do even more detailed scoring against the criteria, and we want to go back and make sure that we've given them the best shake we can, we use a recording. The third one is impact assessment. And what I found that was critical was that you need to find out what the major life ahas and insights have been, because it will reflect where people put their mental energy and where their values and beliefs are. And some of those things will line up often with the criteria. So we look at what are the insights, who have been critical mentors that have had an impact on the candidate. And then in the opposite direction, what we look at is what's the impact the candidate has had, and they pick it: impact on people, impact the organization, significant accomplishments. In other words, what do they value that they have done? And that gives you useful information. 1, 2, and 3, we don't say that it's valid scorable data yet, because it wasn't a story. We don't consider the competencies and role proficiencies and leadership styles to be in stone and to be valid unless they've been shown in the story itself, the different stories they will tell. But what it has given us is what we call themes. Are we hearing things that sound like these roles we're looking for, these competencies we're looking for, the leadership style, any hint of derailers? And we take a break, which is really unusual for most interviews. We say, okay, sign off from Zoom, candidate. We'll call you in 10 to 20 minutes after we've gotten our heads together. And we're very transparent. We tell them why we're doing it. We tell them ahead of time what's going into the interview. They'll always ask us, what can I prepare? And we always tell them, and it's absolutely true, you can't prepare for this interview. They will still try to do something. Even if we tell them, we will tell them often it's about stories in your career. They'll come up with stories, but the minute that we start the process, that goes out the window. We take a break. The people who are assessing hit their heads together and say, what have we heard, not heard? What do we have to have our antenna particularly up when we do the storytelling? We then get into the stories, and I'll go into that in more detail next. 2 or 3 up stories, 1 to do down stories. And then we take another break. What have we heard or not heard against our criteria? Now, one of the things that is a challenge when you do this at the level we do it is that nobody looks that good. Because you come up, with the Boy Scout, Girl Scout list of what a superstar looks like. And when you do this level of assessment, nobody has it all. So what you're really looking for in those criteria, which are the deal breakers? Or the other thing that we do is we assess against the criteria at a high level, the team the person will be working in, so that we can say, well, we've got 2 candidates that are pretty strong, but one is a little better here versus here. Then we say, well, look at the team fit. Will that deficit be made up for by the team, or do they already have that? So a level of sophistication is really understanding how to use your criteria from both a team perspective and the individual candidate and how they work together. So what we do is we say to ourselves, let's say that team building were really critical. You've got somebody who's a project manager, even if they're a technical project manager, and they have to build teams. But you haven't heard any team building. You haven't heard anything measurable around team building from your criteria. Then when you bring them back to the gap filling, this is you lead the horse to water. And in this case, what we're doing is we would say to them, team building is a critical part of this job. We need to know more about that in your role and your experience. Because remember, the only thing that predicts future demonstration of skills is past demonstration of skills. The past predicts the future. If people say, posing those questions of what would you do when faced with this has no predictive validity, don't do it, waste of time again. So we come back and we say, well, do you have an up story or a down story where team building was critical in your role? And they'll either scratch their head and say no or maybe. And if you haven't seen it, it's often hard for people who are new using this technique to understand that if you've done it well and they don't show it, it's not there. It's as simple as that. They don't put any energy there and it's not going to be good. If by chance they come up with something that sounds like team building, you usually discount it by at least 50% in terms of strength. But many times they will say something, oh, I've got this team building story. And when they describe it, it has nothing to do with team building. So if you've done a really good job up front, that's pretty much it. Then at the end, you would do your normal pitch for the business and other sorts of things that are going on. So those are all the pieces of it. Obviously, if you want to get good at this, it takes a while, particularly in the storytelling piece. But let's now talk about the storytelling. And unfortunately, we won't have time for a demonstration. But if Dave ever thinks we want to come back and go deeper on this in any fashion, we'd be happy to do that. So what is storytelling all about? It's the identification of emotion-bound up and down stories. And why does it have to be emotion-bound? Because we need memories of stories that have high detail. Because remember the detail that we have in our role descriptions, competencies, leadership styles, and derailers? If we don't have the detail in the stories to be able to see whether those things are being demonstrated, then we can't find out what the person brings to the party. And what we know just from behavioral science is that anything that has happened in your life, whether up or down, that had a fairly strong emotional component to it, is burned into your brain. It's like a hologram. Your first date with your wife or husband or significant partner, you may be able to go back and remember the music, the sights, the sounds, the ambiance of the location because of the emotion attached to it. Where were you when 9/11 happened? People often can remember exactly where they were, the time of day, everything that's going on. So what we do is we ask for stories one at a time in their professional career that has stuck with them. So when we talk about an up story, it doesn't have to be something like winning the Nobel Prize that made the headlines of a newspaper. It's just something that when people think back about it, they've got a warm glow. Oh, that was good. I felt good about that. I shared that story with other people along the way. Down stories don't have to be abject failures. They are just something as they think about the story, you know, I missed a goal. It didn't turn out the way I wanted to. Took much longer, over budget. It's usually something people would like to do a redo. And then you get them to tell a story, and you do one at a time. And here's more about that. So when we're framing a story, it's important to know that the stories are selected by the candidate. The content doesn't matter at all, because competence travels. And if it's in one story, it'll be in another. And this doesn't put them on the spot. They pick the stories, but the data are just as valid. They provide a short snapshot, whether the story is an up or a down, a few sentences describing the story, why it's an up or a down, and the time frame. Hey, Bill, this took place over 2 hours, 2 days, 2 months, 2 years. And that helps me as the interviewer, anybody on my team doing this, for saying, you know, how much probing, how much fast forwarding am I going to need to do? And we help them. When was this first on your radar? Oh, it was a phone conversation. Take us back to that phone conversation. And that's where the story starts. Interviewer helps the starting point. And one of the things that's critical is we do not allow the candidate to use we. Oh, we did this, we did that. No, we stop them immediately, because we don't know who the agent is. Oh, we accomplished this. No, what was your role? What did you do? And you have to be really tough about that sort of stuff. And sometimes the people are a little frustrated. There's a lot of interrupting as part of this process. There are absolutely no why and how questions. Why causes defensive responses. It changes the quality of the story. How changes the quality of the story as well. People give you more laundry list as opposed to other types of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that they used in the story if you ask a how. No leading questions, not a word in the mouth. You can lead in the other sections, but you can't put words in their mouths. Oh, before you walked in to do that presentation to the board, tell me what you did. Tell me about your planning. Nope. So they tell you you're about to walk into the room, and you can, and about walking in. So you can say, as the interviewer, your hand's on the doorknob. What were you thinking? What were you feeling? Or if they give you an opening and they say, I prepared, you can say, what did you do? But you can't put any context on anything. Otherwise, it invalidates the response. All probes are non-leading, past tense, because past history is the only thing that predicts the future. They're short and they start with what? What did you hear? What did you say? What did you think? What did you feel? What did you see? What did you do? Tell me more, recreate conversations, take me to the next most relevant thing that you're involved in, and any LY word that comes up. Oh, we usually, typically, basically, occasionally. No, give me an absolute specific example. So that's pretty much it. We're going to stop there. I'll talk to the summary points here, and we really don't have time for questions, but you'll have, when you get this, all of our contact information. Feel free to reach out with any other questions that you have. But every successful position search starts with a detailed, valid, measurable criteria. We've seen that. The most effective assessment tool is the GSI. Identifies what they've done in the past, predicts the future. It's the only tool that provides the level of detail required. It removes a significant amount of bias. It removes search committee conflict, because when you've got that level of clarity, people will say, yep, that's the winner. Reduces the number of false positives, people that get picked that people think will be good, and then you've got selection remorse later. 3 months later, you're sitting around the table having a cup of coffee, and you're all looking at each other saying, you know, Joe's not performing. How come we didn't see that 3 months ago when we hired him? Holy smokes, we get rid of that. So false positives, false negatives, confidence in the final decision can be modified to split to fit specific applications. For example, a one-story screening process for investment bankers when they went to Harvard, Wharton, Stanford. They were the challenge for them was to bring back to Wall Street the best people for the second interview with the partners. So they interview 20 people, 20 of these really brilliant kids at these business schools, and they invite back 18 to 19 of them because they're all so bright and analytic and everything else. We created a competency model with all the selection criteria for them, taught them how to do the guided storytelling. They went there, they only had to tell one story, but that can be the deal breaker. They got the people to tell one story in 20 minutes. Immediately, it went down from 18 to 19 to only inviting 3 or 4 back for the second interview. That's how powerful this technique is. It takes time to learn and become highly proficient. As you can see, today was the tip of the GSI iceberg. However, when you get proficient, this is how you will feel. I know I rushed, but if you've got questions, and then we do have something coming up that you might want to take advantage of.
Bill, have you noticed a difference between interviewing male versus female
Not at
candidates?
all. No. There are differences in how criteria, but if you're setting the criteria well up front, for example, the need for influence is critical for leaders to have, whether they're male or female. How that gets articulated is different, and you want to be sure in the competencies, if you have something like political savvy, that it captures both how women demonstrate political savvy and men do as well. So in the criteria setting, it makes a difference, but not in terms of the process.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Bill, I've got a question. It seems to me that verbal ability, a high level of fluency, seems to be a factor in the interviewee's ability to do effective storytelling, to describe all the things you're asking to describe, respond effectively. Yeah. But doesn't this verbal ability, regardless of other job competencies, bias or skew the company's hire decision?
It will if you realize that you have to account for that. And I haven't found that to be the case, Gordon. That you find people who are less articulate, less verbal, still being able to tell wonderful stories. Okay. It's just not their milieu to be, that articulate in communicating.
And you're saying then that you have to make sure that you, the decision maker, are not decision-makers are not letting verbal fluency snow you.
Absolutely correct, because it does all the time. It skews people all the time because they're the ones that seem more engaging and, maybe even funny. They've got more humor and that's not one of the criteria you need. It makes you feel as though they're better, but it's not really what's required.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the bias removal piece that is really important. Sometime on the bias removal, what we'll also do is have people who were not in the original interview only listen to the recording. So because the person's physical presence, how engaging they are, with the smiles and the other stuff, as opposed to listening to the content of the stories and what they accomplished, may be something you want to screen out of the process to make it more fair.
Thanks.
And I think the other piece to that, Gordon, is the effective interviewer probes deep enough. So someone who may not be a great storyteller may have a little trouble. As you probe deeper for the questions, they get to show all the things that someone who may be a little bit more gifted in storytelling would have offered. So they have an equal playing field with a good interviewer.
Yeah, let me add to that too. The interview is structured to help them be better storytellers by the time you get to storytelling, because you start with very non-threatening process, the oral resume. Oh, take me back to high school. What were you thinking? Oh, crap, I didn't know what I wanted to do. Well, tell me more. What happened next? And so you start you get them feeling comfortable with you, of talking about themselves, of being interrupted with questions. And that's the same for the current job demands and the impact assessment. So by the time you get to the stories, in many cases, they have been trained up and much more comfortable with accessing emotional events that they've been through.
I see. Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bill, a quick question. I'm a Rotarian, and I am now interviewing, or have been interviewing, or will be interviewing students for Rotary Exchange, and also for some scholarships. So I'm thinking that maybe this storytelling thing can be a tool we can use to, because at least for the exchange students, they're ambassadors for the US. And so we really want to make sure that they are the right selection of the person to go overseas to represent us. And
Yeah,
Rotary.
Absolutely, because I've used it with kids, students. I used it with junior achievement kids who were trying to, sort of be evaluated at who won the scholarship and things like that. Yeah, definitely can be done. If you want to chat more, just give me a ring.
Bill, I think you're a fabulous communicator, and you've really delved into the topic. I think you have a psychology degree, don't you?
I do.
I thought so, yeah. I mean, you're just wonderful. And I think the storytelling aspect is a very telling thing that tells you a lot about people, just the way they think and the way they organize their words. You are also a wonderful communicator, by the way.
Well, thank you.
I'm wondering, you mentioned how you listen to the transcripts of interviews. Have you ever read the transcripts of the interviews to assess the person?
Absolutely. It's too time consuming. People won't pay for the time it takes to do that. What you try to do with a search committee is train them up on how to use the criteria that you've created with them. And then even when you're reading an application, what we do is we read 2 or 3, and we try to get really different applications, and we teach them how to read for those criteria, role, competency, leadership in the application. And then we show them how to do it in a short interview and how to score against it so that everybody is on board by the end of the process. One of the things in the beginning when they ask us, for example, well, how long is the long interview? Well, it could be 3 to 4 hours. Oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? Nobody does that. Every search committee we've ever done this with, I can't remember one complaint. When they sat through that interview and those 5 sections, it was rapt attention for the whole thing. And afterwards they're saying, I know this person. I really know this person. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
So how long does it take for an amateur like the rest of us in this room to start building up the ability to do this? Do we do it in baby steps? Do we, what would you suggest besides, hiring you to bring us through?
Well, hopefully we get hired by different people or referred to different people, but I'm going to turn it over to Susanna if we can. And Dave said this was okay to do a little pitch.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Peter, because it's a perfect segue into we have a workshop coming up. It's starting a week from Thursday. Bill will get the screen up. It's 6 90-minute sessions. And during this, you'll learn a lot more about leadership and about setting criteria and about the importance of influence. Again, this starts a week from Thursday. As you continue through this, after the 6 sessions, you are able to get certified in the guided storytelling techniques. So there'll be opportunities during those sessions. Clearly, you'll see a demonstration of the storytelling, so you'll know a little bit more about it, appreciate how it works, appreciate even more how all these pieces kind of come together and really make good sense as you're trying to pick the best person for your job. So I encourage you to join us on November 12th. And then I know Nora was going to talk about the link and what that means for people who are associated with NCET for joining us next week from Thursday.
And Suzanne, can you say a little bit more about the first sessions being free at no cost?
Well, it's even better than that, but okay. The first sessions are free. So you can really, and you'll learn a lot in those first 3 sessions. You won't learn how to conduct yourself a guided storytelling interview, but you'll understand how it works and where it works and why it works even better than, because there's just more time to learn more. But if you're associated with NCET, and we appreciate the relationship with this group, just be sure you note that when you apply, and the remaining 3 sessions will also be free.
So basically 6 sessions are for free. If you want to go on to the actual certification and a much higher level of proficiency in it, you will get much more than you were today for sure. And I'll suggest practice and other things between sessions. But we do charge for the credentialing and the certification process that follows the 6 sessions. But I can guarantee if you felt as though you got something out of today, you'll get a lot more out of the 6 sessions.
How much is the certification?
It usually runs $1,000 to $1,200.
And you do a lot of personalized one-on-one work with the folks that are getting certified.
Right. Yeah. A lot of personalized one-on-one feedback. We're listening to your tapes and so forth. Sometimes we can, if there are people that want to do it together, we can pool it and bring the cost down.
If you look in the chat, I have put in the link. I believe it's clickable or copy and pastable to register for the program via Zoom. It's a Zoom, registration is required. So that's just the registration link. You can click it, you can copy and paste it, and then shoot me a little email at info@tbgleaders.com to let me know that you're with this group, so I make sure that your fee gets waived. And that's on the flyer right there. It's at the bottom, info@tbgleaders.com. And that's how you can get in touch with me if you've got any questions about the program.
Thank you, Nora.
Yeah.
I personally think there's so much more to this beyond hiring. And in fact, I would use the skills for interpersonal skills and selling myself and my services more so than hiring, because it works both ways. Don't you think, Bill?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess any final questions about the training or the presentation today?
Well, it's Virginia, and I don't want to say anything more than you did terrific.
Oh, thank you so much, Virginia. I appreciate that.
And then
Pleased to
saying that
meet
you're
you.
going to get more out of 3 free sessions is something to be said for a lot. And getting the certificate would be good too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we're really, being new, we're really interested in exposure at this point. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, we are officially going to wrap up. Bill and your team, thank you all so much. This was excellent. And we would like to talk to you about coming back. And so I'll follow up with you folks. But again, thank you very much. I'm going to end the recording. And anybody who would like to stick around for a little bit more networking is welcome to do so.